Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the haze of deep time, where the land you're standing on isn't highways and houses, but a wide, empty plain filled with sluggish rivers and plants that look like they were drawn by someone who couldn't decide between fern and Christmas tree. You tilt your head, squint against the dust, and realize you're in Montana, though not the Montana with cowboy bars and billboards about huckleberry pie. This is the Montana of 76 million years ago, when everything around you still feels raw and unsettled. The ground is damp, the sky carries the thick promise of a storm, and in the distance something heavy shifts the air with each footfall. You can almost feel it in your chest before you see it. You know what's coming, and it isn't small. Achelousaurus, the horned dinosaur who looks both fierce and a little incomplete, lumbers forward. Its skin is a dusty red-brown, mottled to match the mud banks. Its face is wide, frill jutting from the back like a bone shield. But instead of proud, spear-like horns above its eyes, it carries rounded bosses, thick, bony swellings that look like someone started carving horns and then got distracted. It's a dinosaur with a face that seems to shrug at you. Here's the thing. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes here. Between the predators in the shadows, the untrustworthy rivers, and the mosquitoes that feel genetically engineered to ruin your life, it's a miracle anything manages to eat, let alone nap. But lucky for you, you're just a quiet observer, drifting like a ghost through this landscape. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where people are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward through the grit, your shoes, if you had any, catching on roots and stones buried shallow. The horizon here is deceptive. It looks close, but when you start walking it keeps sliding away. The smell is strong, earthy, almost metallic, like wet clay mixed with pine resin. You notice how the sky is wider than you're used to, clouds stacked like dark anvils on the edge of a storm. A single bird glides overhead, except it isn't a bird. It's a pterosaur, wings catching the wind in long, lazy arcs. Its cry is rough, not pretty. More like the screech of a rusty hinge than a mourning dove. And there, along a shallow rise, you see impressions of footprints. Wide, three-toed marks pressed into mud that hardened under a sun you'll never feel. Achelousaurus tracks. Each step almost a meter across, filled with rainwater now. You crouch near one and dip a finger in, half expecting the print to ripple with fresh weight. But it stays still, quiet. Somewhere nearby, the real thing is moving, and you can feel the faint percussion of its stride through your knees. Mainstream fact time. Achelousaurus was discovered in the 1990s by Jack Horner, the same paleontologist who advised on Jurassic Park. He found it in the Two Medicine Formation of Montana, a fossil bed famous for revealing whole herds of dinosaurs. But here's the quirky bit. Horner originally thought Achelousaurus might just be a teenager form of another horned dinosaur, Pachyrhinosaurus. Imagine finding a skull and debating whether it's a whole new species or just the prehistoric version of an awkward middle schooler. Historians still argue whether Achelousaurus really deserves its own title or if it's basically a rebranded cousin. The debates get heated, which is funny when you think about people in pressed khakis fighting over bones that haven't cared about names for 76 million years. You keep moving through the valley, brushing past cycads with waxy leaves and horsetails that look like bristly green pipes. The plants crowd close, swishing against your legs. Somewhere, unseen, something large crashes through branches. Maybe another herbivore, maybe something hungrier. You find yourself wishing for a better soundtrack than your own footsteps. The mosquitoes whine near your ears, persistent, prehistoric. You swat at one out of instinct, but your hand passes right through. Ghost rules. Ahead, the ground rises into a ridge. You scramble up, hands sinking into gritty soil, and pause at the top to catch your breath. From here the plain spreads wide. Herds move like slow rivers of color below, hadrosaurs with crested heads, smaller ceratopsians clustering together. And then, finally, Achelousaurus itself. It doesn't roar or charge. It just grazes. Its mouth works steadily, cropping plants, chewing in its quiet way. A heavy tail sways behind it, a counterweight for the big head. Its frill flares slightly when it lifts its head, scanning. You can't decide if it looks cautious or bored. Maybe both. Its skin bears scars, pale streaks across the darker hide, proof of fights with rivals or narrow escapes from predators. You sit on the ridge and watch as the storm finally cracks open. Lightning cuts across the sky, thunder rolling like a slow drum. Rain hisses down in sheets, plastering your hair against your face. The dinosaurs don't scatter, they just adjust, turning backs to the wind, carrying on. Life here doesn't pause for weather. It never does. And you oddly feel calm. The air is heavy, but it presses you into the moment. The rain hides everything distant, leaving just the shapes close by. Achelousaurus, horns that never were, frills slick with water, chewing as if nothing matters but the next bite. Maybe that's the secret of survival here. Don't overthink it, just keep chewing. You slide down the ridge, shoes, again, imaginary, squelching in the thick, sticky mud that has become its own trap. The storm drifts eastward, leaving the air soaked and metallic, and you wander closer to the herd. Up close, Achelousaurus isn't as monstrous as you first thought. It's solid, sure, but the details soften it. The most striking thing is the head. You expect the dramatic spears of Triceratops, or maybe the punk rock spikes of Styracosaurus, but what you get is lumps. Two great knobs of bone rise above its eyes like swollen bruises. The nose sports a thick ridge, rounded, almost polished by time and combat. The frill at the back, wide and shield-like, carries scalloped edges, but no glittering spikes. It looks unfinished, like the artist ran out of clay halfway through the project. You tilt your head and try to imagine what this animal's rivals thought. Was it impressive? Intimidating? Or did the others laugh? Probably not laugh. Dinosaurs don't exactly have the lips for that, but maybe they gave it the side-eye. The point is, compared to its horned relatives, Achelousaurus looks a bit plain, hornless but not hopeless. And yet you can tell it doesn't need to prove itself. This is a tank with legs, a multi-ton wall of muscle powered by hay, more stubborn than stylish. It lowers its broad skull and nudges another in the herd, a gesture that might be friendly or not. The contact makes a hollow thunk, a sound that echoes through the damp air. They push once, twice, then go back to grazing like nothing happened. Mainstream fact: paleontologists classify Achelousaurus as a ceratopsian, the same family as Triceratops. The bosses and bumps on its skull weren't random mistakes. They were part of a bigger pattern among horned dinosaurs. Each species evolved its own unique headgear, whether spikes, horns, or knobs, as if showing off in an endless contest of who wore it better. Here's your quirky tidbit. The name Achelousaurus actually comes from Greek mythology. Achelousaurus was a river god who lost his horn in a fight with Hercules, which makes sense for a dinosaur missing the horns everyone expected. It's basically paleontology's version of a dad joke, immortalized in Latin. And yes, historians still argue whether those bumps were weapons, display ornaments, or both. Some insist Achelousaurus used them for headbutting like modern muskoxen. Others suggest the bosses were brightly colored, maybe covered in keratin that glowed red or blue, meant more for showing off than fighting. Imagine two of them in a prehistoric staring contest, faces flushed like badly sunburned watermelons. You crouch closer, ignoring the mosquitoes drilling at your ears, And picture what these animals looked like when alive. Not the faded bone-white skulls in museums, but creatures with real presence. The skin stretched tight over those bosses, veins pumping, keratin layers shining like polished helmets. When two collided, it must have sounded like bowling balls smacking together, a deep crack that carried over the plain. Another joke sneaks in your head. If dinosaurs had chiropractors, Achelousaurus would have bankrupted them. Those neck muscles? Overkill. Imagine carrying a 100-pound bike helmet all day, every day, while chewing a diet of fiber salad. The herd shifts again, a low ripple of movement. You hear the slap of tails in the wet mud, the rhythmic crunch of teeth grinding plants. The juveniles linger at the edges, smaller but already sporting the telltale bosses. They mimic the adults, head nudging in miniature practice rounds, like kids with boxing gloves that are 2 sizes too big. You glance out toward the tree line, where shadows linger. Tyrannosaurs, maybe. Always tyrannosaurs. They're not here yet, but you know they're watching. That's the thing about the face of Achelousaurus. It might look goofy to you, but it's still a deterrent. A predator weighing the odds might look twice at those bone bosses and decide an easier meal lurks elsewhere. You wonder, did the horns vanish over time? Did evolution trade them away for thicker, blunter armor, built not to stab but to absorb punishment? There's no answer you can touch. Just theories, debates, long papers in dusty journals where paleontologists use words like ontogeny to argue whether Achelousaurus was really just a phase of another species. But the dinosaur itself doesn't care. It lowers its massive head again, scoops a mouthful of soggy ferns, and keeps chewing. Rain drips from the ridges of its frill. Its eyes flick lazily toward you as if to say, "Horns or not, I've survived this long." The air thickens again with humidity, making every breath feel like soup. You swipe at your forehead, not that it helps. Around you the herd sways gently, their bulk forming a wall of warm, breathing bodies. The ground is alive with vibrations, dull thuds of movement, soft shush of tails in mud. For a moment, you feel tucked in, like part of the herd yourself. And you think, maybe horns were overrated anyway. The rain eases into a steady mist, but the sky refuses to clear. You trudge forward, boots sinking into patches of mud so deep you imagine losing one with each step. The air has turned swampy, heavy, charged with that metallic taste storms leave behind. Every breath feels like you're swallowing damp cloth. This is river country, braided channels of water, sluggish and brown, carving their way through flat ground. Mosquitoes hover in clouds, each one convinced it deserves your undivided attention. You stop by a bend in the river where roots claw into the bank like skeletal fingers. The current isn't fast, but it carries a deceptive pull. You imagine yourself slipping in, dragged under, lungs full of water that hasn't yet decided whether it wants to be river, swamp, or stagnant pool. This is the same water the dinosaurs drink, the same water that floods in spring, drowning entire herds when the melt from distant mountains surges through. Life here is balanced on the thin edge of patience with nature's mood swings. The Achelousaurus herd navigates this with a kind of casual resilience. You watch one lumber down toward the water's edge. Its front legs splay slightly, toes broad, spreading weight so it doesn't sink. It lowers its thick head, frill shadowing the ripples, and dips its beak into the current. You hear the slurp, like a kid sipping the bottom of a milkshake through a straw, and for some reason, it makes you smile. Not majestic, but real. Mainstream fact: the Two Medicine Formation, where Achelousaurus fossils were found, was once a floodplain cut by rivers and dotted with lakes. Seasonal droughts and violent thunderstorms shaped the landscape. Fossils of fish, turtles, and crocodiles alongside dinosaurs tell us this was a wet, dynamic environment. Not exactly the endless desert people sometimes picture when they think prehistoric. Here's the quirky bit. Evidence from mud cracks and fossilized nests suggests these storms were brutal enough to wipe out entire dinosaur nurseries. Imagine setting up a cozy nest, only for the whole river system to suddenly decide it wanted that spot back. Like building your dream house and finding out it's actually on floodplain real estate. Bad investment, zero resale value. Historians still argue whether these wetlands encouraged herding or forced it. Did dinosaurs group together to face the unpredictable weather, or were they simply drawn to the same shrinking waterholes when the land dried up? The fossil record offers clues but no certainty, and the arguments stretch on like the rivers themselves. The storm returns in bursts. Thunder snaps overhead, so sharp it feels like the ground flinches. You spot lightning fork across the horizon, touching down somewhere unseen. The herd stiffens, their tails flicking in unison, but they don't scatter. They know the drill. Just another summer storm. You, on the other hand, feel the electricity crawling on your skin. Hair prickles on your arms, and you take an involuntary step back from the water, just in case. You picture the world's least dignified obituary. Time traveler fried by lightning, survived 0 days in the Cretaceous. One Achelousaurus shifts closer to you, its bulk blotting out half the river view. Drops of water cling to the bosses on its face, sliding off in slow rivulets. Its eye meets yours, steady and unreadable, like a cow deciding whether you're worth the effort of acknowledging. It huffs once, a wet snort, and goes back to drinking. You wander upriver where the banks widen and the mud sucks at your steps. Crocodiles slide silently beneath the surface, smaller than modern ones, but still nothing you'd want near your ankles. One lifts its head, jaws just breaking the water, and you realize the stretch of river is less peaceful oasis and more underwater waiting room for things with teeth. The herd crosses anyway. One by one, they wade through, the water climbing high on their flanks, tails swishing like rudders. The crocodiles don't move. Too small to risk it. That, or they know better than to tangle with a wall of ceratopsians that could flatten them without noticing. You decide to follow, stepping lightly into the shallows. It's colder than you expect, numbing your calves almost instantly. The mud oozes between your toes. If you had toes in this place, and you stumble halfway across, catching yourself on nothing but air. By the time you reach the far bank, you're shivering despite the humidity. The herd grazes on the other side, tearing up ferns that grow thick where the soil is richest. Steam rises off their backs as the sun pushes faintly through cloud cover. You slump down on a half-submerged log, water dripping off your clothes, and let the soundscape settle in. The crunch of jaws, the low rumble of distant thunder, the endless whining buzz of insects that never seem to sleep. And for all the discomfort, the mud, the wet clothes, the bugs, you realize it's hypnotic. The rhythm of chewing, the slow movements, the muted colors of the floodplain. It lulls you. Nature's white noise machine, 76 million years early. The air clears just enough for the horizon to sharpen, though it's still heavy with that damp, electric tension storms always leave behind. You trail the herd along the plain, feet dragging through mud, when you catch a shift in the atmosphere, not just weather, but presence. The Achelousaurus paws mid-chew, heads lifting in almost perfect unison, ears tuned to something you can't hear yet. Their tails stiffen. You know what this means. The neighbors with teeth are near. At first, you catch only movement in the tree-line. A ripple of branches, a dark form melting between shadows. Then another and another. You're not looking at herbivores. These are predators. Tyrannosaurs, smaller cousins of T-Rex, but still large enough to turn your entire existence into a cautionary tale. Think Albertosaurus or Daspletosaurus, all jaws and attitude. They don't charge. Predators rarely do unless they're sure. They stop. They wait for panic to ripple through the herd, because panic creates mistakes. And mistakes create dinner. The Achelousaurus aren't in the mood to panic. You watch one step forward, its rounded bosses catching the fading light, frill angled high. It exhales a long, guttural sound. Not a roar, not cinematic, but a resonant rumble that carries more warning than drama. Others mirror the stance, lining up in a crescent. Heads low, shoulders squared. A barricade of horns that aren't quite horns. Mainstream fact. Tyrannosaur species lived alongside ceratopsians in late Cretaceous North America. Their fossils are often found in the same formations, evidence of predator-prey dynamics. In fact, bite marks on ceratopsian bones sometimes match tyrannosaur teeth exactly, proof that these encounters didn't always end peacefully. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Achelousaurus skull found had partially healed bite marks right on its frill, which means it got attacked, survived, and kept on munching plants like nothing happened. Imagine walking around with tooth-shaped scars in your head like it's just another Tuesday. Dinosaurs were nothing if not stubborn. And here's the ongoing debate. Paleontologists still argue whether tyrannosaurs were primarily hunters or opportunistic scavengers. Did they stalk healthy herds like this? Or did they prefer to wait for a drought, a flood, or a natural death before stepping in? Tonight, watching the standoff, you get the sense the truth might have been both. The predators edge closer. You can see them now, sleek under mottled skin, their teeth flashing in little arcs of light as they test the air. One snarls, deep and guttural, and you swear it vibrates your ribs. The herd shifts tighter, the calves tucked in the middle, adults forming a wall. It's strategy without a playbook, instinct without hesitation. And you? You're frozen. If you were really here, you'd already be a snack, because you're standing out in the open, squinting like someone who can't decide whether to run or narrate. Lucky ghost rules apply again. You're invisible, safe, useless. One predator makes the first bold step into the clearing. It prowls, head swinging side to side, measuring. Its foot sinks deep into mud, leaving a crater behind. You hear the faint click of claws. For a second, it looks directly through you, and your heart does a useless little backflip. Then, with a snarl, it lunges, not into the herd, but just enough to provoke. Testing. The front line of Achelousaurus barely flinches. Instead, two of them swing their heads forward, bosses cracking together like boulders colliding. The sound alone makes you wince. The predator stops, ears flicking. That wasn't panic. That was a warning. You think about modern animals, buffalo staring down lions, elephants circling against hyenas. The same playbook written tens of millions of years earlier. Herbivores aren't helpless, and sometimes the most boring-looking ones, the ones with awkward faces and no flashy horns, turn out to be brick walls with stomachs. The standoff drags. Minutes pass. The predators pace, frustrated. One darts in again, quicker this time, snapping at a juvenile near the edge. But the adult beside it swings its massive skull sideways, smacking the predator's jaw with a thud so sharp it echoes. No blood, no drama, just physics winning the day. The predator recoils, shaking its head, snarling like it can't believe the audacity. Finally, with a low growl that sounds almost embarrassed, the tyrannosaurs retreat back into the trees. Their shadows fold into the forest, and the herd exhales. The wall dissolves. Heads drop again to the plants, jaws grind, tails swish. Just another day on the floodplain. You let your shoulders relax, realizing you've been holding your breath this whole time. The rain has stopped, the clouds parting just enough to let a weak sunset smear the sky orange and purple. You think, if predators are the drama, then herbivores are the lullaby. They just keep going, keep chewing, keep living. And the truth settles on you. Horns or no horns, Achelousaurus never needed flash. It needed endurance. And endurance is what it had in spades. The storm has finally broken, leaving the plain rinsed and gleaming. Puddles sparkle in low places, the soil smells like wet stone and pine resin, and the herd spreads into the open like hungry commuters rushing into a buffet. You trudge along, shoes squelching in imaginary mud, and realize what you're about to watch isn't a hunt or a showdown. It's dinner time. Welcome to the Cretaceous salad bar. Everywhere you look, plants dominate. Ferns crowd the edges of streams, cycads squat like oversized pineapples, and conifers stretch spindly arms toward the sky. Horsetails cluster along the wetter patches, their hollow stems snapping underfoot with a brittle crunch. This was the menu for Achelousaurus, a diet of fibrous greens and low-growing shrubs, everything tough enough to make modern kale feel like cotton candy. You watch one Achelousaurus lower its broad, parrot-like beak to a patch of cycads. The beak clips leaves with brutal efficiency, like garden shears. Behind the beak, batteries of teeth grind the plants into paste. Each chew releases a damp crackle, the sound of cellulose surrendering. The dinosaur doesn't hurry. Bite, chew, swallow. Repeat. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians had dental batteries, rows of teeth stacked like conveyor belts, constantly replaced as they wore down. This allowed them to process enormous amounts of plant matter more efficiently than most modern herbivores. Triceratops alone could chew with a force strong enough to pulverize wood. Achelousaurus wasn't quite as famous, but it had the same design. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some paleontologists think the plants of the late Cretaceous were so fibrous and resin-filled that eating them might have been like gnawing on raw pine cones. Imagine a lifetime of chewing through pine cones and pretending it's food. Suddenly your broccoli doesn't sound so bad. And here's the debate. Scientists still argue whether ceratopsians were selective feeders, choosing the best bits of cycads and ferns, or indiscriminate lawnmowers. The wear patterns on their teeth suggest both theories at different times. Were they picky gourmets, or were they the prehistoric equivalent of people who just shovel whatever's in the fridge onto a plate? The herd spreads wider, each individual tearing into its chosen patch. You notice how methodical they are, stripping plants to stubs before moving on, leaving behind bare soil like neatly trimmed lawns. The younger ones fumble a bit, ripping stems and dropping half of what they pull, much like kids trying to eat spaghetti without staining their shirts. You try to imagine the flavor. Bitter? Resinous? Maybe sour in that way pine needles taste if you chew them too long. Achelousaurus doesn't mind. Their stomachs, vast fermentation chambers, turn this forest into fuel. Steam puffs from their nostrils in the cooling evening as they digest, little smoke stacks burning through green energy. Mosquitoes buzz close, but even they seem sluggish after the storm. One lands on the thick hide of an Achelousaurus calf, and you watch it try and fail to pierce the leathery skin. The calf flicks its tail, annoyed, and goes back to chewing. For a moment you almost feel bad for the mosquito. Almost. Your stomach growls. Not that you'd want any of this. You picture a prehistoric salad bar with nothing but horsetail, cycads, and conifer needles. No dressing, no croutons, just endless bitter greens. You'd starve before finishing a plate. But for Achelousaurus, this is paradise. They graze in rhythm, the whole herd chewing like an orchestra of crunches and grinds. The sound is weirdly hypnotic, like popcorn popping in slow motion. You lean against a log, eyelids heavy, listening to the steady background music of survival. And as the sun slides lower, painting the clouds gold and lavender, you realize something important. Achelousaurus doesn't need to roar, or chase, or dazzle. Its superpower is simple, turning the roughest, toughest plants into the fuel that lets it stand its ground against anything with teeth. You smirk, thinking, prehistoric kale diet, 0 cheat days, and still nobody got abs. The night creeps in slowly, not like a switch but like someone dimming the world with a heavy curtain. The herd settles along a ridge near the river, heads low, jaws still working in slow, steady rhythm. You sit with them, listening to the crunch of plants, when a different sound drifts in, scraping, faint, deliberate. It isn't animal. It's human, though not the kind you'd expect in this Cretaceous night. Time folds, and suddenly you're standing beside a group of paleontologists in the 1990s. The mosquitoes are still here, but now you see men and women in wide-brimmed hats, sunburnt faces, and wool socks shoved into hiking boots. They kneel over the same ground you just trudged across, only now it's stripped of life, just dust and stone. Brushes in hand, they lean close, sweeping dirt away from shapes hidden for 76 million years. One mutters about the grant running out. Another complains that their trowel keeps chipping on limestone. A third squints through glasses fogged with sweat, trying to decide whether the ridge of bone they're uncovering is a frill or just another boulder laughing at them. Science isn't glamorous out here. It's sunburns, blisters, and the constant paranoia of losing your toothbrush to a curious pack rat in the tent. Mainstream fact: Achelousaurus was first described in 1995 by Jack Horner, working in the Two Medicine Formation of Montana. Horner was already famous for discovering Maiasaura, the good mother lizard, and for rewriting how we think about dinosaur parenting. But this new skull, with its strange bosses and missing horns, threw paleontology into a fresh storm of debates. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some early digs in Montana were fueled less by scientific institutions and more by pure stubbornness. Local ranchers sometimes stumbled across bones while fixing fences or watering cattle, and paleontologists had to barter, beg, or sweet-talk their way into access. There's at least one story of a dig crew being bribed with home-baked pie. Apparently, blueberry works better than grant money. And here's the debate. Paleontologists still argue about how much you can infer from fragmentary fossils. The skulls of Achelousaurus were often found incomplete, weathered by millions of years of storms and shifting soil. Reconstructing them is like putting together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the picture on the box is just a rumor. Did those bosses grow larger with age? Did some individuals sprout short horns before wearing them down? Or is Achelousaurus just Pachyrhinosaurus caught in evolutionary mid-sentence? You lean closer to one dig site. The air is dry, the ground cracked, but beneath the dust a pale curve emerges. Someone whispers, "We've got bone." Brushes move faster, then slower, as though afraid of breaking the silence. A half-buried skull appears, eye socket hollow, frill edges jagged with time. The paleontologists sigh, equal parts exhaustion and relief. You notice their socks are mismatched. One striped, one plain. Someone hasn't had laundry day in weeks. Another pulls a sandwich from a cooler, only to realize it's been sitting in the sun for hours. A warm bologna and mayo fossil in its own right. You almost laugh. Dinosaurs had teeth to worry about. Paleontologists have food poisoning. The days stretch long for them. Sunrise at 5. Digging until heat makes the rocks shimmer. Afternoons spent logging coordinates, sketching fragments, swatting flies. Nights around a camp stove, eating beans from cans while coyotes howl in the distance. One graduate student plays harmonica badly. The others groan but don't tell him to stop. It's the only music out here. And all this for bones. Bones that tell them only whispers, never full stories. Bones that force arguments in conference halls, where slide projectors click and someone inevitably sighs, "We need more specimens." You drift back toward the ridge. The herd of Achelousaurus is still there in your mind, chewing calmly, oblivious to the fact that millions of years later people in wool socks would argue passionately about whether they deserved their own genus. The juxtaposition is funny. You picture one of these scientists, sunburnt and sore, trying to lecture the real Achelousaurus on taxonomy. The dinosaur would blink, snort, and keep eating. No patience for semantics. Survival doesn't care about Latin. The paleontologists pack up for the night, covering the fragile skull with plaster jackets, careful not to leave it exposed to the weather. Tomorrow, they'll haul it out with ropes and grunts, load it into a rattling pickup, and send it off to a museum basement where interns will label it with barcodes. You watch the process and realize, this is how stories survive. Not through the living herd in front of you, but through fragments and patience. Through people who spend summers sweating into socks just to bring one skull home. The wind picks up again, rustling tents and brush, carrying grit across the site. The herd fades from your sight, swallowed by dusk. But the scrape of brushes and the quiet muttering of scientists stay, echoing in your ears like a different kind of thunder. Morning haze curls low over the plain, damp and cool, while you trail the herd farther south along a ridge that rolls into shallow valleys. The air smells faintly of resin and wet stone, a little like someone just watered a pine nursery. You glance ahead at Achelousaurus, and here's the odd thing. The more you look, the stranger it feels. Not frightening, just awkward. Like a dinosaur halfway through deciding what it wanted to be. The frill is broad, rimmed with small scallops. The nose carries that blunt, bossy ridge instead of a proud horn. Above the eyes sit two rounded domes. Not spikes but thick swellings of bone that look like knuckles welded to a skull. Compared to its famous cousins, Achelousaurus is the oddball ceratopsian, the one that doesn't quite fit the family photo. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians, as a group, are one of the most diverse dinosaur families. Triceratops, Styracosaurus, Centrosaurus. They all evolved wildly different horn and frill arrangements. Each species seemed to be experimenting, turning its head into a billboard of identity. In that parade of flair, Achelousaurus stands out for being understated. No spikes, no swords, just lumps. Quirky tidbit: some paleontologists have actually called it the unicorn that lost its horn. Not in print, of course. You won't find that in textbooks, but around campfires and in museum basements, that joke makes the rounds. It's a dinosaur that feels like it misplaced the very thing it was supposed to be showing off. And here's the debate. Was Achelousaurus truly its own species, or just an in-between stage of another? Some researchers argue it's a transitional form linking the spiky Styracosaurus with the hornless Pachyrhinosaurus, caught in evolutionary midstep. Others insist it had its own stable population, distinct enough to earn a genus of its own. Even now, after decades, the arguments roll on. You picture a family reunion. At one end sits Styracosaurus, all dramatic nose, horn, and fan of spikes. At the other, Pachyrhinosaurus, with its broad boss like a prehistoric battering ram. And in the middle, awkward cousin Achelousaurus, holding a paper plate of ferns, mumbling, "I'm part of the family too." But awkward doesn't mean weak. You watch two of them square off, heads swinging low, bosses colliding with a sound like logs slammed together. No stabbing, no gory punctures, just blunt force physics. Their frills rattle, dust spraying off their hides. When one finally backs down, it isn't because it's bleeding, but because the other just won the battle of endurance. Sometimes awkward kids fight hardest. You sit on a rock and imagine how different this face must have looked in life. The boss is covered in keratin sheaths, maybe even brightly colored. A flush of red when angered, maybe a waxy sheen in sunlight. Display mattered. Ceratopsians weren't just about defense. They were about being seen. You can almost hear the muttering. Historians still argue whether these frills were weapons, thermoregulators, or fashion statements. The truth? Probably all three, depending on the day. The herd continues, their odd faces bobbing like helmets in formation. You stumble after them, nearly tripping over a root. One calf stops to look at you, its bosses barely budding, still more suggestion than armor. It blinks once, then trots to catch its mother, leaving you to feel oddly seen. And for a moment you get it. Achelousaurus doesn't need to be the Triceratops poster child. It doesn't need Hollywood horns or spiky glamour. It survived in its own awkward way, in an environment that punished hesitation. Oddball or not, it belonged here, chewing endlessly in the shadow of storms. You grin. Every family's got the weird cousin. Turns out, dinosaurs were no different. The sun climbs higher, burning away the mist and leaving the floodplain sharp and glaring. Heat shimmers over the ground, bending the horizon into waves. You trudge beside the herd, sweat sticking to your shirt, or it would, if you weren't ghosting through time. The Achelousaurus keep their slow, steady march until the smell hits you. Something sour, something heavy. Death lingers here. You crest a small rise and see it, bones scattered in the dirt, half buried in cracked mud. Not just one skeleton, but dozens. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all tangled as though some giant hand dumped a drawer of bones and left them to bleach. This isn't a random scattering. It's a bone bed, a place where time piled death into layers. The herd pauses. They don't mourn, but they sense it. Nostrils flare. Heads lift, scanning. Then, as if reassured, they drift past, chewing again. You're the only one left standing in the silence of the dead. Mainstream fact. The Two Medicine Formation is filled with such bone beds, sometimes containing dozens or hundreds of individuals. These sites tell us dinosaurs often lived, and sometimes died, in herds. Achelousaurus fossils, in particular, have been found clustered this way, evidence they weren't solitary wanderers but community creatures. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some paleontologists nicknamed one site the unlucky cow pasture. The concentration of bones looked eerily like modern cattle that drowned in floods or collapsed during drought. Imagine stumbling across a prehistoric mass grave and thinking, yep, dinosaurs had the same bad luck as cows. And here's the debate. What killed them? Was it a sudden flash flood, sweeping whole herds into a watery grave? A slow drought, where weakened animals collapsed around shrinking waterholes? Or even volcanic activity choking the air with ash? Each theory has evidence, none are conclusive, and the arguments can stretch through entire conferences. You kneel in the dust and run your hand, your ghost hand, along a fossilized frill. It's rough, cracked, but unmistakable. You imagine the living head it once shielded, the chewing mouth, the blunt bosses that pressed against rivals. Now it's silent, part of a puzzle that keeps confusing scientists 76 million years later. The herd grazes nearby, unconcerned. Life doesn't pause long here. You picture the cycle. Dinosaurs live, eat, fight, die, and their bones become stories. Some stories sink under mud and stay hidden forever. Others resurface when a storm peels back soil, or when a paleontologist with sunburn and stubbornness finds them. The air is still oppressive. Flies buzz over the exposed bones as though time didn't matter. The silence makes you uneasy, so you whisper aloud, though nobody's listening, was it flood, drought, or something else? The ground doesn't answer, but you feel the weight of time pressing in, as if even asking the question makes you part of the same puzzle. And then a breeze stirs. The herd shifts, tails swishing, heads turning. Life moves on. The bones stay behind. You catch yourself thinking, being unlucky in the Cretaceous didn't take much. One bad storm, one dry season, one slip in the mud. Maybe these Achelousaurus weren't cursed. Maybe they were just living in a world that never forgave mistakes. Still, the sight lingers. A plain filled with chewing dinosaurs up front, and behind them, a graveyard that looks almost identical to a herd still grazing. living and dead, layered like pages in a book, waiting for someone to read. The sun climbs toward noon, painting the floodplain in a harsh, glaring light that makes the mud glisten like wet glass. You trudge after the herd, boots sticking and sliding in patches of clay, when you notice something different. The terrain changes. Low ridges give way to a series of shallow depressions filled with water, shallow ponds left behind by the storm. Steam rises faintly from their surfaces, creating a haze that makes the landscape look as if it's breathing. Achelousaurus wades carefully through the puddles, toes splaying wide to prevent sinking. Their frills drip water, bosses gleaming like damp stones. You notice how precise their movement is. This isn't random wandering. Every step is measured, deliberate, almost like a dance honed over generations. Each individual knows how deep to step, how to balance against the suction of wet mud, how to avoid the lurking predators you hope aren't around. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians weren't just grazers, they were also adapted to varied terrain. Their broad feet and strong limbs allowed them to navigate soft floodplain soils and shallow waters, unlike more delicate herbivores. Achelousaurus could trudge through mud and marsh with relative ease, carrying hundreds of pounds on its shoulders without sinking entirely. Quirky tidbit: paleontologists have found fossilized footprints that suggest Achelousaurus sometimes tiptoed through wet areas, almost as if they were testing the mud like someone stepping across a puddle without wetting their shoes. You can almost imagine a prehistoric yoga class, limbs stretched, toes splayed, balancing on damp soil. And here's the debate. Scientists still argue whether the footprints indicate deliberate behavior or just the natural biomechanics of their movement. Were they avoiding deep mud intentionally, or is the pattern simply a byproduct of their gait? The tracks leave room for interpretation, teasing us with small clues. You wander along the edge of a pond, watching calves paw at the water, sending tiny ripples outward. They dip their beaks, flinging mud into the shallow water. One calf flicks its tail, creating a small wave that splashes over its own frill. It shakes it off and goes back to chewing, oblivious to the chaos it just created. The adults graze near the banks, jaws grinding, steam puffing from their nostrils in the rising heat. You notice one Achelousaurus pause, nostrils flaring, scanning the horizon. Its eye catches a glint in the shallow water. Not a predator, just sunlight hitting a cluster of rocks, but the instinct to check, to be vigilant, remains. Evolution has trained it well. Survival depends on these split-second assessments. Mainstream reality check. These ponds aren't just harmless. They're also home to small crocodilian relatives, turtles, and amphibians. Predators could lurk just beneath the surface, hidden, waiting for an opportunity. Achelousaurus knows this, and instinct keeps it cautious even as it drinks and grazes. You take a careful step, imagining yourself in the shallow water, mud squishing underfoot. The calves glance at you, but their attention is fleeting. Life doesn't stop for observation. And neither do the adults, chewing methodically, chewing rhythmically, chewing in a slow, hypnotic trance that makes you feel sleepy, almost. You remember the fossils back in the museum. Fragmented skulls, partial frills, bite marks. Here, in real time, you see the same creatures moving, alive, negotiating every puddle, every risk, every meal with patience and persistence. There's no spectacle, no fireworks, just the steady pulse of existence. By the time you step around the pond, the herd has moved again, heading towards slightly higher ground. Their rhythm is mesmerizing, like waves of green and gray shifting across the plain, unstoppable yet unhurried. You follow silently, aware that you're learning the language of survival in subtle motions. Frill angles, tail flicks, the slight flare of nostrils. And as the sun climbs higher, burning shadows into the mud, you realize the lesson here isn't danger or spectacle. It's endurance, adaptability, and the quiet power of doing exactly what you need to do, day after day, storm after storm, puddle after puddle. By late afternoon, the floodplain begins to dry, the sun slanting low enough to cast long, lazy shadows across the mud. You follow the herd as it climbs a gentle incline, frills catching the light, bosses gleaming faintly like polished stones. The air is thick with warmth now, almost syrupy, and each step makes your feet sink just slightly, leaving shallow impressions that will vanish with the next storm. The herd moves in a loose formation, adults on the perimeter, calves tucked safely in the center. There's a rhythm to it, a measured pace that feels deliberate. Nothing flashy, no sudden dashes, no dramatic horn clashes, but every movement counts. Each step is survival in slow motion. You notice the subtle sway of frills, the slight pivot of tails, the way they shift weight from one massive leg to another. It's a choreography of mass, balance, and instinct. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians often traveled in herds for protection, especially in floodplain environments. Herding behavior reduced individual vulnerability to predators and increased the chances of spotting danger early. Fossil trackways frequently show parallel lines of movement, evidence that these creatures coordinated in ways that still fascinate paleontologists today. Quirky tidbit: some fossil evidence suggests that Achelousaurus might have engaged in ritualized shoving contests, where adults pushed each other with their heads and bosses, not necessarily fighting, but testing strength and hierarchy. Imagine a prehistoric push-up contest, full of dignity and dust. And here's the debate. Historians still argue whether these interactions were primarily social, related to mating, or purely defensive. Were these bumps on the skulls showy status symbols, tools for combat, or both? Evidence is inconclusive, leaving room for speculation that these dinosaurs had personalities and politics far more complex than the fossil record can fully reveal. As you follow the herd, you notice a calf lagging slightly. Its legs are shorter, its movements clumsy. You can almost hear a miniature soundtrack of grunts and squeaks as it struggles to keep up. An adult shifts toward it, nudging with a boss gently but firmly. Not aggression, guidance. The herd is patient, steady, adaptive. The landscape around them is alive in subtle ways. Birds flit overhead, shadows darting across the mud. Small lizards skitter among rocks. Insects hum in the undergrowth. It's easy to forget that the herbivores you follow are the main event. The floodplain itself is a quiet symphony of life, much of it unnoticed but essential to the ecosystem. You pause near a shallow ditch, watching an adult lower its massive head to graze. You imagine the chewing. Thousands of bites a day, fiber ground down, nutrients absorbed slowly but effectively. Every chew is a testament to endurance, the methodical labor that keeps life moving forward. Lightning clouds in the distance catch your eye, a reminder that storms are never far away. The herd senses it, adjusting slightly, no panic, just anticipation. Their instincts, honed over millennia, keep them aware of subtle cues humans might overlook. Humidity shifts, wind changes, scent trails. Every detail is survival. You reflect on the contrast with paleontologists of decades later, kneeling in dust, brushing fragments with painstaking patience. Those scientists work in bursts of observation and imagination. These dinosaurs operate in real time, unthinking but perfectly adapted. Both are searching for understanding, but only one actually experiences it firsthand. As shadows stretch longer, you feel the herd begin to slow, settling in for rest. Dust rises with each exhale, mixing with the warm air. The adults position themselves strategically, the calves nestled safely between. You watch the rhythm of their breathing, the slight flick of tails, the subtle shifts in frills. Survival is quiet now, deliberate, almost meditative. And you, following in ghost-like silence, feel a strange kinship with this pattern. Enduring, moving, chewing, resting, day into night, storm into calm. Twilight descends slowly, painting the floodplain in dusky hues of mauve and amber. The herd has stopped moving, settling into clusters that maximize safety. Adults form protective circles around calves, frills angled outward, tails flicking intermittently to shoo away persistent insects. You find yourself sitting just beyond their perimeter, absorbing the gentle rhythm of chewing and shifting, the subtle sounds of a world that is neither quiet nor loud, but insistently alive. The sky above stretches wide, the first stars winking through fading sunlight. A soft breeze carries the mingled scents of wet mud, crushed ferns, and the faint tang of river water. It's peaceful, almost hypnotic, and you feel your eyelids growing heavy. But the herd remains alert, ever conscious of threats that could appear at any moment. The balance of caution and calm is their secret. The floodplain is both home and hazard. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians likely relied on keen senses to detect predators. Their eyes were positioned to allow a wide field of vision, and their bosses and frills may have played roles in both defense and communication. In this way, herd survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was sensory coordination, a constant, low-level negotiation with the environment. Quirky tidbit: fossil evidence suggests some ceratopsians might have used their frills as canvases, displaying colors that varied with age, health, or social status. Imagine a prehistoric mood ring, visible from across the herd, signaling, "I'm strong, I'm calm, I'm hungry but not desperate." The subtlety of these signals would have mattered more than any dramatic horn flash. And here's the debate. Paleontologists still argue whether frills served primarily as defense, thermoregulation, or social signaling. Evidence exists for all three, but assigning a single purpose is nearly impossible. Perhaps the truth, as often happens, is a complicated combination of biology and behavior. As darkness deepens, insects begin their nightly chorus, buzzing, clicking, skimming across the water and vegetation. The herd remains largely undisturbed, bodies swaying slightly with the motion of chewing. One calf stumbles and corrects itself, nudged gently by a nearby adult. Mistakes are small, but corrections are swift. The herd moves as one organism with many minds. You notice a faint shimmer across the river's surface. Bioluminescent algae, perhaps, or just reflection, but it lends a quiet magic to the landscape. The herd steps carefully along the edge, heads low, nostrils flaring as they test the air. Even in darkness, they navigate without panic, a living testament to adaptation and instinct. You remember the paleontologists brushing dust from the skulls decades later, meticulously reconstructing behaviors they could never witness. Here, under the same stars, you see those behaviors unfold in real time: grazing, nudging, testing the water, responding to subtle cues of danger. Observing them feels like reading a book whose words are etched in motion and sound rather than ink. Thunder rumbles faintly from a distant horizon, a reminder that the weather is never fully at rest. The herd doesn't panic. It shifts slightly, adjusting positions, preparing for potential rain or wind. Even in rest, vigilance persists. The floodplain is never completely safe, and survival demands constant attention. You settle on a patch of dry mud, letting the rhythm of the herd lull you. Chewing, shifting, tail flicks, distant thunder. The world contracts to these repeating motions. Your own breath slows, syncing almost involuntarily with the quiet pulse of life around you. And in that stillness, you realize something essential. The Achelousaurus endurance isn't just about strength or size. It's about consistency, patience, the subtle art of being present in every moment, responding to every minor shift without overreacting. Survival here is a matter of attention, repetition, and quiet resilience. Night has fully claimed the floodplain now. The air cools rapidly, carrying the faint, earthy scent of wet soil and crushed vegetation. Stars shimmer overhead, mirrored faintly in the shallow pools dotting the plain. The herd has slowed to near stillness, bodies huddled close for warmth and safety. You drift alongside them, invisible but deeply aware of every subtle movement. The shift of a shoulder, a twitch of a tail, the rhythmic rise and fall of massive flanks. The world feels suspended. Even the insects seem quieter now, cautious in the cooling air. A faint hoot echoes from a distant tree, a primitive owl relative, perhaps, briefly punctuating the hush. It's the kind of sound that makes you lean in, half expecting the night to respond, though all that responds is the gentle sway of Achelousaurus frills catching the faint moonlight. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians likely rested at night in large groups to minimize predation risk. Fossilized trackways suggest that nighttime congregation in one area was common, reducing individual vulnerability and allowing juveniles to benefit from adult protection. The herd's arrangement, adults on the outside, young inside, maximizes safety while still allowing access to necessary resources. Quirky tidbit: some researchers propose that ceratopsian frills may have glowed faintly under moonlight due to keratin or vascular structures reflecting or refracting light. While this is speculative, imagining the herd outlined with subtle moonlit patterns adds an almost magical quality to your ghostly observation. The odd cousin Achelousaurus may have been a glowing night watchman of sorts. And here's the debate. Paleontologists still argue whether ceratopsian frills had a thermoregulatory function at night. Did blood flow through the frill help them stay warm in chilly floodplains, or was it solely for display and defense? Evidence is suggestive but inconclusive, leaving open questions about how physiology intertwined with survival strategies. You notice a slight rustling at the water's edge. Not predators, small amphibians and lizards skittering across wet mud, cautious of the towering giants. The herd barely registers them, focused on maintaining formation and conserving energy. There's a rhythm to the night that requires no words, just the steady, unconscious movements of massive bodies. One adult shifts, nudging a calf gently with its head. The calf corrects its position, resting its snout against the adult's flank. You imagine the subtle social dynamics: reassurance, guidance, hierarchy maintained without drama. The herd's cohesion depends on these small gestures. You pause, thinking about the fossil record. The bones buried under centuries of sediment, the careful brushes of paleontologists, everything points back to moments like this. Subtle, unremarkable, profoundly important. Each frill angle, each careful step, every chew contributes to survival and legacy. The wind picks up faintly, carrying the scent of the distant forest. The herd shifts again, minor adjustments, almost imperceptible, responding to stimuli you can't detect. Night is alive with cues, and Achelousaurus reads them instinctively. You feel almost intrusive, observing, yet the herd continues its quiet ritual, indifferent to your presence. And as the moon climbs higher, casting silver light across mud and water, you understand that survival isn't about grand gestures. It's about presence, subtlety, and enduring each cycle of day and night. The herd sleeps, but not entirely. They remain partially alert, a living balance of rest and vigilance. In that hush, you feel the weight of time, the millions of years that have passed, the fossilized records, the scientists piecing together fragments, and recognize the continuous thread of life, quiet and persistent, weaving its story across epochs. Dawn edges over the horizon, brushing the floodplain with muted gold and rose. A soft fog rises from the shallow pools, curling around low-lying plants and the herd's massive legs. The air is thick with dew and the faint tang of disturbed soil. You trudge along behind them, noticing the subtle sounds of morning. Water dripping from frills, mud squelching underfoot, distant bird calls that ripple through the quiet. The herd begins to stir more actively. Adults stretch, shifting weight from limb to limb, tails flicking methodically to clear insects. Calves mimic the motion, stiff-legged and awkward, wobbling like toddlers learning to walk. There's no rush. Life here operates at a deliberate pace, shaped by millions of years of repetition, survival honed into motion and habit. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians were diurnal, active mainly during daylight hours. They used early mornings to feed when the air was cooler and softer plants were more palatable. Trackways support this pattern, showing directional movement consistent with daily foraging cycles. Quirky tidbit: some paleontologists speculate that Achelousaurus may have engaged in subtle social greetings at dawn, rubbing frills together or nudging one another before setting off to graze. It's almost like a prehistoric handshake ritual, understated but meaningful, signaling cohesion and hierarchy without fuss. And here's the debate. Scientists still argue whether these behaviors were primarily for social bonding, establishing dominance, or just incidental consequences of close living. Fossils reveal interaction but rarely illuminate intent, leaving room for interpretation and sometimes wild conjecture. You watch a pair of adults carefully navigate a shallow pond. Their massive feet leave temporary impressions in the mud, quickly filled by splashing water. One calf tries to mimic the motion, slips slightly, and lands with a wet splash that triggers a ripple of annoyance from nearby adults, but no harsh response. Guidance without violence. This is herd learning in action. The floodplain hums with subtle activity. Insects buzz faintly, lizards skitter, and small amphibians hop between puddles. The herd moves with deliberate attention, heads low to graze, but every sense tuned to danger. You almost envy this precision, the unspoken communication, the perfect timing of vigilance and feeding. You notice the soil beneath their feet is dotted with fossils, tiny fragments of shells, bone, and plant matter. It's a reminder that this place has hosted life for millions of years, layer upon layer. The herd's every step adds another thread to that long tapestry. The present and the past blur, and you feel like a traveler witnessing a story that is simultaneously unfolding and being preserved for eternity. An adult nudges a young one, prompting it to shift closer to the group. Frills brush, subtle clicks and thuds echo faintly. You can almost hear an internal rhythm, a heartbeat of coordination. Life, it seems, is a symphony of small movements, repeated endlessly, unnoticed except by those paying attention. The sun climbs higher, dispersing the fog, illuminating the floodplain in clear, stark light. Shadows shorten, reflections shimmer in the shallow pools, and the herd moves steadily toward a distant ridge. No rush, no drama, just methodical, continuous survival. You follow, mesmerized, thinking about the fossils yet to be unearthed and the stories they will tell. The herd, unaware, writes those stories in footprints, in chewed plants, in subtle nudges and shifts. And you, watching, understand that history is alive here, ephemeral and enduring at once. Midday heat ripples across the floodplain, turning the mud into a warm, sticky canvas. You follow the herd as they climb toward slightly higher ground, the frills of adults catching the sun and casting long, lazy shadows. The calves move with uneven, energetic steps, tails swishing and heads bobbing as they test the boundaries of the group. The air smells faintly of crushed ferns and sun-warmed soil, and you notice how the stillness amplifies even the smallest sound, the tap of a claw, the snap of a twig, the distant chatter of early birds. The herd pauses near a cluster of conifers. Leaves rustle faintly as adults lower their heads, beaks nibbling at branches, while calves tug clumsily at low-hanging stems. There's an almost meditative rhythm to it. Chew, swallow, shift, chew again. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just the steady pulse of life in repetition. Mainstream fact: ceratopsians were herbivores that relied on constant grazing. Their dental batteries allowed them to process tough, fibrous plants efficiently, sustaining massive bodies over long hours of feeding. Without this methodical consumption, survival on the late Cretaceous floodplain would have been impossible. Quirky tidbit: some paleontologists suggest that Achelousaurus occasionally dug shallow pits to reach fresh roots, a behavior reminiscent of modern elephants or pigs. Imagine a dinosaur using its beak as a prehistoric trowel, shoveling up snacks like a giant gardening enthusiast. And here's the debate. Researchers still argue whether these pit-digging behaviors were intentional foraging strategies or accidental outcomes of other movements. Fossilized disturbances in sedimentary layers suggest intent, but evidence is rarely definitive. As you watch, an adult nudges a reluctant calf forward, prompting it to follow the group's slow, determined march. The calf hesitates, slipping slightly in the sticky mud, but the adult's gentle nudge reassures it. Herd dynamics are subtle, maintained not through force but through patience, coordination, and constant reinforcement. The terrain changes subtly: gentle slopes, scattered rocks, shallow waterholes. Each feature demands attention. The herd navigates carefully, balancing weight, testing footing, adjusting frills to brush away insects. It's a quiet, continuous negotiation with the environment, nothing sudden or theatrical, just survival expressed in tiny, perfect movements. In the distance, dark clouds gather. The herd pauses, nostrils flaring, scanning the horizon. Even without dramatic action, you sense tension, instinctive, understated. They shift positions, subtly, readying themselves for rain or wind. You can almost feel the anticipation vibrating through their massive bodies, a silent acknowledgement of danger. You think about the paleontologists again, carefully uncovering skulls decades later, reconstructing lives from fragments. The herd moves unknowingly, but in ways that mirror what the bones tell us. Coordinated, methodical, enduring. Life is steady here, punctuated only by instinctive reactions, subtle interactions, and the unending rhythm of grazing. The herd resumes its slow progress across the plain, the light shifting, shadows lengthening, movement as meditation. You follow, mesmerized, caught between witnessing survival and understanding the faint echoes of history preserved in bones yet to be discovered. Evening drifts in with soft indigo hues, the floodplain bathed in the gentle glow of a setting sun. Shadows stretch long, merging and folding over one another as the herd moves toward a low ridge, seeking shelter for the night. Dust rises faintly with each step, catching light like gold powder, and you feel a curious sense of calm watching these massive, awkwardly beautiful creatures navigate the terrain with effortless patience. The herd slows near a cluster of ancient conifers. Adults settle first, lowering their heads to graze while calves nestle between their legs. You notice the subtle interplay, frills brushing lightly, tails shifting to ward off insects, occasional nudges that communicate more than words ever could. There's no rush, no panic, just quiet, deliberate movements honed by millennia of survival. Mainstream fact: herd behavior in ceratopsians was likely crucial for protection, allowing adults to shield juveniles from predators. Fossilized trackways and bone beds support the idea that Achelousaurus and its relatives traveled and rested in groups, reinforcing safety and social bonds through proximity. Quirky tidbit: some researchers speculate that Achelousaurus may have used its frill for subtle nighttime signaling, reflecting moonlight to communicate position or mood to nearby herd members. While speculative, it paints a picture of a silent, glowing conversation unfolding under starlight. And here's the debate. Paleontologists still argue whether these nocturnal behaviors were primarily social, defensive, or a combination. The fossil record offers hints but rarely certainty, leaving room for imagination to fill in the gaps. The first stars blink into the sky as the herd gradually comes to rest. Adults settle, calves nestle safely, and you notice the soft rise and fall of flanks in synchrony, a rhythm both hypnotic and grounding. Insects hum faintly in the background, wind stirs the treetops, and distant water ripples softly. Survival here isn't about drama. It's about consistency, awareness, and subtle communication. You reflect on the millions of years that separate you from these creatures. Paleontologists, decades later, will uncover fragments, piecing together lives from skulls and bones. But here, in real time, life unfolds without concern for legacy, and yet it leaves one. The motions, interactions, and environment are all recorded in footprints, where patterns on frills, and the sediment itself. As night deepens, a gentle hush blankets the floodplain. You feel the herd's presence, steady and enduring as they drift into rest. The cycles of day and night, feeding and vigilance, continue uninterrupted. There's beauty in repetition, in the quiet persistence of existence, in the subtle choreography of survival. You step back, letting the herd fade into shadow, feeling the weight of time, of life both fleeting and eternal. Observing them is a meditation, a lesson in patience, endurance, and the quiet wonders that unfold when you slow down enough to notice. The floodplain holds its breath with you, and the story of Achelousaurus drifts softly into memory. The night settles completely now, soft and deep, stretching across the floodplain like a heavy, velvety blanket. You watch the herd in your mind's eye, lying quietly among shadows, bodies shifting only as necessary, breaths slow and even. The stars above twinkle faintly, and the moon casts a pale, gentle glow over mud, water, and scattered fronds. Everything feels still, but beneath the calm, life hums in delicate persistence. The low rhythm of respiration, the occasional twitch of a tail, the soft shuffle of hooves on earth. Your own breathing slows as you imagine walking among them, ghost-like, feeling the texture of soil underfoot, smelling the faint sweetness of crushed plants. The herd's patience, their subtle communication, the careful, deliberate movements, all this seems to fold time into a single, calming pulse. You feel yourself blending with it, carried along by the quiet cadence of existence. The floodplain is timeless in this moment. Storms may come, waters may rise, life may shift and change, yet the rhythm continues. You sense the presence of countless generations, both in the herd now and in fossils buried beneath the earth, whispering their ancient secrets. It's a lullaby woven from millions of years, slow, steady, patient. Let your mind drift with the scene, frills catching moonlight, calves nestled safely, adults vigilant yet calm, the gentle murmur of life uninterrupted. The past and present merge, leaving only a sense of connection to something enduring, silent, and profound. Every movement, every breath, is part of a story that never fully ends. Now, you feel your own eyelids grow heavy, syncing with the herd's steady rhythm. Let the soft pulse of this prehistoric world guide you into sleep, carrying away worries, leaving only calm and continuity. The floodplain fades into darkness, the herd's shapes dissolve, and all that remains is the gentle, endless heartbeat of life.